miss a word you say, but we have to be.
I'm sorry, I'm interrupting you. I'm going to mute.
Test. I think we can start. There may be a few more coming in from worship, but good morning and thank you for being here. This morning we're continuing our series on a life of service, reflections on pastoral ministry and the future of the church. And we have with us today Carol Pagelsenj. And you've heard Carol in church reading scripture, but we get a chance here to get to know her better and explore her faith journey and her experiences in ministry. So here's a little introduction. Carol Pagelsenj is married to Dr. John Beyer retired neurologist whom she met 24 years ago at a church she was serving in Sacramento, California. So John, raise your hand. Where'd John go? There you are, okay. Having received permission from the session to date, they were married following Carol's last worship service there. Carol thought she would be retiring, but went on to serve another church in California. After she and John moved to Myrtle Beach, she helped out at First Presbyterian for 2 years. And now, finally, Carol says she's really retired. So thank you, Carol. And we're going to just begin with a question and answer. And if you have questions, you can pop up during or wait till the end. But we'll use the same questions that we used last time. So Carol, what was your faith experience as a child? In your home, in your church? Yeah, you're on.
Okay. Well, I'm from Alabama, and there weren't many Presbyterians in my hometown of Jackson, Alabama, which is sort of like 60 miles north of Mobile. I was raised in a Southern Baptist family, and never really questioned that. Questioned a few things that went on in the family and in the church. But basically, my mother was divorced when I was about 5 years old. We were living down in Mobile, and she had no means of income. I can see most of us are all the same generation. And so when she was divorced, she went back to Jackson to live with her aunt and uncle up there in Jackson. And they had no children, had no children. And so we moved in with them. And their house was right across the street from the church. And they were stalwart members of the community. My uncle was the optometrist in town and the jeweler and watchmaker in town. And my aunt was known as a very, very righteous, upright woman in town. What people in town did not know, and in fact what we did not know because it wasn't known in those days, was that she was a paranoid schizophrenic. We didn't have diagnosis of that sort back in those days. And we did not have drugs to treat that condition back in those days. So we moved in with this couple who were already, quote, elderly. And we had to adapt to their schedule and their way of living. My aunt went around humming and singing hymns all the time. We had a housekeeper, we called a maid, that did everything there in the house, and she went around singing gospels. So this was my environment growing up. And when Aunt Wincy had spells, usually when my uncle came home, I was asked what I did to cause these spells. So I grew up learning to say, I'm sorry, not knowing what I was sorry for, but having to take the responsibility for setting Aunt Wincy off and causing these spells. So one of the important lessons I learned early on was it doesn't cost a whole lot to say, I'm sorry, but it does do something to your personality. My mother got a job due to my aunt and uncle's status in the community. She got a job as a bank teller. And later on, she went to work for my uncle there in the jewelry shop. She was desperate to get out of there. She knew it was not a good situation for me. and she dated just about any single man in town to try to find a new husband and get away. She knew that it was not good for me to be in that environment. She did eventually find another man to marry, but she had something of a reputation in town, and sometimes I was reminded by schoolmates or Sunday school class members of that reputation, which was not pleasant. I thought my aunt and uncle were probably saints because they prepared communion. And every time communion was done over at the church, and they lived right across the street from the church, it was a very, very solemn occasion, and probably still is in the Baptist church, whereas in the Presbyterian church, it's a more celebratory. We say, this is the feast of Jesus Christ. And it's a, you know, come one and come all, let us celebrate. Whereas in the Baptist church, it's on the night that he was betrayed, da 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 da. But I thought everybody thinks, you know, because they fix the communion, that these people are just holier, holier, holier people. And if they only knew. Well, I think my uncle, well, these are great aunt and uncle for me, but I just called them aunt and uncle. I think my uncle was a saint. He put up with a lot. But my aunt certainly was no saint. And when she did have these spells, she would get under the bed or lock herself in a closet, but sometimes she was quite violent. I can remember being chased with knives, pushed out of cars that were going, chased with a gun, all kinds of weird stuff, which I repressed. And it wasn't until I was an adult that I thought, did I dream this? Or did it really happen? So in college, I decided to major in psychology because I wanted to know, is it catchy? Am I going to end up like this? Or I wanted to understand it better. So that led me into that area, that field of psychology. In my first 2 years at Howard College, it was called back then, in Birmingham, Alabama, Baptist College, I majored in psychology. I was not too interested in taking requirements because I was so eager to just learn about this subject of psychology. And then at the end of my first year of college, my uncle died, and my aunt decided women didn't need education. None of the other women in my family had gone to college, and they'd done all right. They just found a good man and married, and he took care of them, and she didn't see any point in helping me go to college, so the money dried up with her, and I was just left hanging with 2 years of college and no prospects for marriage. I didn't want to look. I wasn't interested in that, and so that was it. Fortunately, my mother, on her third husband now, had moved to Winter Park, Florida, and I went down to visit, and there was a nice little college down there called Rollins College, and I called them up and said, could I come over and audition? I did have a voice. Somebody had told me, the preacher's daughter had sat in front of me one Sunday and said, "You can sing." And so I called them up and I said, "Could I come over and audition for a scholarship?" And so I did, and they gave me a scholarship. And I said, "Thank you very much." I really hadn't thought a whole lot about this transferring from one college to another, or hours, or what all that was involved in, but it was a way to keep going to college. And I would do anything I had to do in order to keep going to college. And they said, "Well, now you need to major in music or theater or something else, because we'll take your hours, but we don't offer a psychology major here. But we'll take all of your hours and put them in the basket." So, unfortunately, while I was there, and I was living at home with my mother and her husband, and now they had my sister, who was the child from the second marriage that my mother had. I didn't like to spend much time at the house because I didn't get along with the third husband. And so I hung out with the theater people and the music people there on campus, and I had a little bit too much social life. And was not doing well with my studies, and was doing even less well with my personal life. And I became pregnant, and I had to drop out. And that was a real stunner for me. I was so ignorant because nobody had ever explained things to me back in Alabama. I was so ignorant, I didn't really understand how I got pregnant. But now I had to figure out what to do about it, and I had no support from anyone. And I mean, I did know who the father was, but it was summertime, and he'd gone back to Massachusetts, and I wrote him a letter and got no response, and I figured I've got to figure this out for myself, and contacted a lawyer who arranged an adoption.
So Carol, I want to interrupt for a minute. There's so much here. So can I go back? As a little kid, you got by and you learned by the way to live and survive is to say, "I'm sorry."
Yes.
I'm sorry for
I'm
things
sorry.
I didn't even do. It was just sorry. And it sounds so, and then you were in this home where people are humming hymns. What was that like? Did you feel that because it sounded like the people who were doing communion, you know, we see that in the church, they always look so sanctimonious and perfect, and you think the church is all God-given and wonderful, and then you saw underneath that, it isn't as good as it looks. So what was your experience as a kid that there was no safety, right? There was...
Exactly. The Lord helps those that help themselves.
And you helped yourself.
And I don't want to say this in a bad way because I've learned to love myself, but I was an opportunist.
Yeah.
It's like if you find a way to get out of a situation, if somebody throws you the lifeline, you grab it.
Yeah.
It's like being offered the scholarship. You know, I'll take it. I take whatever is offered that's going to get me out of a bad situation.
So talk a little bit about those lifelines. It sounds like the first one, you went to, was this the one where there was no one to support you for college, right?
Mm-hmm.
They said you can't go because,
Right.
And so you went for the audition, right?
Right.
That was, you initiated that.
Right.
And then the lifeline. So can you talk more as you look back about lifelines? Where were there, I mean, I think all of us can go back and say, where was a lifeline in my life? I didn't do it. I saw it and I grabbed it.
I've had so many. Many.
Can you talk? We have time. But I also don't want you to share anything you don't feel comfortable sharing.
Well, I guess the next lifeline after the adoption of my child, and I did not know what I was going to do at that point.
The adoption of your child. This is, we're back on you, so you're back on being pregnant, right? So, okay, let's go back there. So you're pregnant, and then what happened?
Had the baby, put her up for adoption, and didn't know what I was going to do at that point. And somehow going through some papers, I discovered that I had this insurance policy from my uncle. And I thought, oh, here's some money that I didn't know I had. And I tried to commit suicide right after I gave my child up because I didn't want to live with myself. I felt like I had done the most terrible thing I could do by giving my child up, but it didn't work. I had taken all my pills, I had gone to bed, I had written my little note, and for some reason, my mother and her husband had a big fight. And my mother came over to my apartment that night. And she found me. I mean, you know, we make plans and God laughs, or God intervenes. And she found me that night and called the ambulance, and my life was saved. So after that, I decided I'm not going to try that anymore. That is not in God's plan. I have always been a believer, always. Faith has never, and even with the thought of suicide, I knew that would not separate me from God. I'm not one who believes that suicide takes us away from God. Anyway, she somehow gave me a whole file of papers or something, and I'm going through that and find this insurance policy, and there's enough money when I cash that thing in that I can buy a ticket. I'm thinking, you know, what am I going to do with the rest of my life? And I've had this scholarship for singing, and I realize I do have a voice. What can I do with this voice? I buy a ticket to Vienna, Austria.
Just like that.
This is a silly little Jackson, Alabama girl buys a ticket to Vienna, Austria. And so I go to Vienna, Austria, and I audition for a scholarship to the Academy of Music, and they give it to me. And it includes meal tickets. And then I auditioned for Vienna's English Theater, and they hire me. So now I can afford an apartment, and I've got meal tickets.
How old are you then? About
20, early 20s. And so now I've got a place to sleep, and I got food to eat. And I get introduced eventually to a young man who's just the most gorgeous person I've ever seen. And I stay in Vienna for 3 years, start the American Opera Workshop there, and eventually marry this young, handsome Austrian. And we have 3 years of marriage and American opera. I mean, those Austrians really need some cultural appreciation, you know. And we bring it to them, American opera. And then we come back to this country because I decide I want to be, now I really want to be a parent. And I want to have my own children and give this husband a chance to have the American dream. And we get back here and he says, thank you very much. So now I've got 2 children and no husband and no way to make a living except I get back into Rollins and finish up with my degree from Rollins and start teaching school, which I quickly discover is not my gift. I am not a teacher. And but I'm part of a divorce group, a divorce recovery group, and I start sort of leading the group, and one of the pastors says, you know, you're pretty good at this. I think it's probably your psychology background. And I've taken a few more psychology courses there at Rollins, and I've graduated now with, between the 2 schools, I've managed to get 2 degrees, a Bachelor of Arts and a Bachelor of Science, which is really crazy. But he says, I graduated from Louisville Seminary with a degree in a focus on pastoral counseling. I think you'd be great at pastoral counseling. And like I've done with just about everything else, I said, oh, okay. I'll try that. So I went up to visit a lady who had 2 kids. She was single, and she was doing okay up there. And she said, nobody has ever been kicked out of Louisville Seminary for lack of funds, because that was my main concern. And she said, come on up here and, you know, if you get in, they will take care of you. So I did all the testing that you have to do to get into seminary and passed that, and Louisville took me, and I went up. And I was focusing on pastoral counseling. I did all the clinical pastoral education, went through all the degrees right up to supervisor for clinical pastoral education, and thought I would be a hospital chaplain. Did work through the hospital, went into mental health, did all the mental health things, and got out, worked for Southern Indiana Mental Health in a mental hospital, worked for Central State Mental Hospital, Southern Indiana, and then realized this is not good for my mental health. I was not leaving it at the office. It was going home with me, and it was affecting my family life. And I didn't know what direction to go in. And we had one of these, back then we called them the Synod schools. It's a week where everybody comes, everybody in the Synod comes. It's sort of like a big camp, church camp thing. And was talking to an old classmate. And I say old because I was 42 when I got ordained. So I was one of the older students. And I said, I have done so many things and been so many places and tried so much stuff. I don't know what to do at this point. And she said, well, why don't you do what you learned in seminary? And I'm going, what? She said, be a pastor. Be a pastor. Yeah, be a pastor. Well, I don't know how to preach. She said, try it. So I went to one of these events where pastors looking for churches meet churches looking for pastors. They used to have these. You come and you would interview with, 6 or 7 churches, and they'd interview with 6 or 7 people. And the first church I interviewed with called me.
That's just crazy. Whoa.
This is the way God has worked with me. God doesn't give me a whole lot of choices. God just says, here. And I say, okay.
Lifeline.
It really. And so I went there to do the candidate sermon. This is the old system, the way we used to do it. The candidate sermon at a neutral pulpit. And the guy who was the pastor of that church came back and said, I don't know what's going on today. I have about 20 members of my church. This is a little church in Illinois. And there's about 50 people sitting out there. And I don't know where they came from.
Oh, because this is...
I found out later the chair of the PNC had put a sign at my church, if you want to hear preaching today, go over to Greensboro. So everybody from my church had come over there to hear me preach. Well, at the end of the service, this little old lady came out and she said, well, I've heard better.
I've heard what?
Better. And I said, well, thank you. I'll make note of that, and I'll try to do better. But they voted to call me. And for the next 5 years, preaching was the most terrifying thing I had ever done. Every Thursday, because I said, I'm going to have that sermon done by Thursday evening so that when the kids get home from school on Friday, I don't let this part of my life affect this part of my life. We're going to have a good weekend together before Sunday. I'll be there for my children. So Thursday, I had a panic attack every Thursday, every single Thursday. Because when you're writing that sermon and you're thinking, at least for me, I'm thinking, I represent the Word of God. I'm standing before people and saying the Word of the Lord. I mean, we say that after we read the Scripture, but then we're also preaching. And a lot of people sitting out there listening to that sermon are extending that phrase, the word of the Lord, on through the sermon. And that's a terrible responsibility. It's got to be faithful. What we say has got to be faithful to what we just read in that book. And it would make me sick. At first I thought I was having a potassium crisis. I'd run over to the manse was right across the street, and I'd eat an orange. No, it didn't help. And I'd go back and I'd sit at the typewriter and I'd start up again. And then it finally hit me, you're having panic attacks. And it took me a long time to get over that, to finally realize you're doing the best you can. You're being as faithful as you can.
Well, I'm so struck by the courage of your honesty and the depth of your experience, Carol. That's just, and I'm struck right now at the integrity and the feeling inadequate and the who am I to preach the word of God. I mean, what right do I have? So how did you get through that? I mean, here you are, having lived such a difficult life, so you had that going for you. You know, that,
Or against.
well, yeah, but
For and against, yeah.
Yeah, maybe for and against. I would say for, but also against, yeah. How is it for? Like, how was, from the very beginning of your little girlness, it was a struggle. So you knew from the beginning that you had to say, I was sorry to get by. So it was, what can I do? So how do you see that that grounded you in a stability? How was that good for you? And recognizing that I'm here, was it your determination just to be honest, to be faithful? What did that mean? How'd you work?
I think, people talk about receiving the call. And that whole phenomena of the call was something I didn't understand. And when I was in seminary, everybody's going, well, I got the call, and I got the call, and I was so-and-so years old, and I was, and you've heard that story about the guy out there plowing in the field. I kept wondering, well, what is the call? I felt like I was just reaching for whatever I could grab, the opportunist.
Yeah.
And I thought, well, but God knows that. God knows me. That the Psalm says, you know when I lie down and when I get up. You know every breath that comes from me. You know me inside and out. Well, God knows me. And God knows I'm an opportunist. I'm going to reach for whatever I can reach for, because that has been the way I've had to live my life. In order to survive, I've had to grab whatever I could grab whenever it came along. But the call, I don't know what this call business is all about. But I found out. I had an evening off when I was doing one of my clinical pastoral, we call it CPE, clinical pastoral education evenings. And I was off that night. I didn't have to go to the hospital. I had good friends that I had introduced to each other. Ann and Drew, John's met them. Ann and Drew were sort of courting, and they were also my babysitters, because my kids were quite young when we were in seminary. And I would do anything for Ann and Drew. Well, almost anything. Ann and Drew called and said, we are on call for Baptist Hospital tonight, but we had a date. And Drew said, I was planning to ask Ann to marry me tonight. So would you take our call at Baptist Hospital? Okay, Drew, I'll take your call. Only because don't you tell anybody else in the program that I took your call, because I wasn't going to be a backup for anybody else. But I'll take it for you tonight. Okay. So I go over to Baptist Hospital to take their call. And I'm sitting around at the nurse's station, and all of a sudden the nurse says, oh, problem in room, blah, blah, and need the chaplain to go down there. So I go down, and I said, what is the situation? And she said, There's a young woman down there who just had a baby. And she's given it up for adoption. And she doesn't believe that anybody can understand her situation and that God has forsaken her. I said, okay. So I go down there to that room. And as I stepped through the door of her room, I received my call like a flood of light that washed over me. And I knew of all the people, Methodist, Catholic, Baptist, Presbyterian, who were in our program right then, I was the only person who could walk through that door and tell that young woman, I know what you're going through and that God loves you. That was my call. And I knew that God was saying to me, I can use anyone. I can use anyone. Even you. So don't ever doubt me. That's a call.
So, before we go on, and I don't even want to look at the time, I don't want to know. So you wondered, where's the call, where's the call, where's the call? And then you saw yourself as a little kid as an opportunist, but God knew you. And so all those things that happened to you along the way, do you see that as God's hands? Like you said, I'm always a believer, and I'm thinking, how could you be a believer with all of that going on, you know? And so as you look at it now, was that God's hand in your life from the get-go?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. When people say faith is a gift, yes, absolutely. I have done nothing to earn it, work for it. It's just absolutely a gift. And God keeps on giving it.
I almost hate to go on, but I will. So you walked into that room, and you knew the only person that could reach that woman and save her from despair. And that was your call. And then what happened? Like
With her?
No, with you.
Uh,
So
I
you
was
were
having-
in the church. Were you in the church then?
Oh, yeah.
Okay, and that was, where is this church now? This is,
I was in seminary.
oh, you're in seminary.
I was in seminary. That was, yeah.
And then, but there's so much, but then so you went and they called you. You gave the sermon, and that woman said, not good enough, but.
Yeah, that was several years after seminary. Right after I graduated from seminary, I worked in mental health for 5 years.
Wow. You have done it.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, and so you worked for 5 years, and then what? Where does this happen, going into the room with the woman who
That was still in seminary.
That's still in seminary.
Yeah.
But that was your call.
That's when I received my call.
And then what about the first church you served? Where was
In Neoga, Illinois. Neoga is a Kickapoo Indian word for deer crossing. And that's how big it was.
And how many members of the church, and what was that like? Was that hard? Did you feel God's hand in your life?
It was God's hand. I thought, this is the end of the line, but it was the perfect place for a first church for me and for my children. There were about, I would say, 55, 60 people in worship every Sunday. Mostly elderly, which wasn't too bad because, I mean, I was up there. I was approaching 50. My children were in junior high. My daughter was in 6th grade. My son was in junior high. They were making good grades. And in a small town like that, their names would be published in the paper if they were on the honor roll. And all the little old ladies would come up and pat their hands and say, I saw your name in the paper. And they had all these grandmothers and grandfathers. And I remember we had a carnival come through town, and one of the carnies was talking to my daughter, and several ladies came over and said, Carol, did you see there's somebody talking to Natalie? And you better go see, everybody's watching out for these kids. And the day that my son got his driver's license, he said, Mom, can I take the car out for a few minutes by myself? I said, yeah, where can you go? I said, yeah, you can. I had 5 phone calls. Carol, do you know Mark's got your car? So, for a first church, and they were very, very forgiving of my sermons, and I got better. It was a good place for me to learn to preach, and for the children, it was wonderful. When I moved from there, Mark stayed there because it was his senior year. So he stayed there with a parishioner and finished up his senior year, and Natalie wanted to go ahead and move. We moved to Kokomo, and she wanted to go ahead and move to the big school.
And so, back on this it sounds like this was the first community that held you for who you were and your kids, and it was home. Mm-hmm. And then you left, and was that another call? What was that? Why did you move?
Just ready. Ready.
And what did you move to?
Kokomo, Indiana.
And what'd you do?
Pastor.
Yeah, I didn't know.
Yeah, and while I was in Kokomo, I started taking, at the urging of an executive, I started doing training in conflict management. And they paid for it. The Synod paid for it. This is, again, one of those things where something is offered and I take it. And they continued to pay for me to go to every level of conflict management. It was offered first by the Synod and then by Alban Institute, and the Synod kept paying. And they said, we want you to continue in this, and we want you to be available for the Synod and then for the larger church. And that's how I got into specialized interim ministry.
I don't know what that is.
It's a specialized ministry. And then you go to churches that are either in conflict or have a special situation, like a pastor that's been there for 30-something years. And even though they may not be conflicted, if you've had a pastor for 30-something years, you need a special interim to come in and sort of help them I don't want to say wash away that pastor, but prepare the ground for a new pastor, because otherwise whoever they call is not going to measure up to whoever they had. So you need a specialized minister to come in and prepare for the next one. So that's what I did for the next the rest of my career.
Can you talk about a time where it worked?
It always worked but once.
Oh,
One time it did not work.
do you want to talk about that, or maybe not?
Well, I'll just say they couldn't get rid of the old pastor.
And the pastor didn't want to leave either? Was that his?
You know,
was
he
still-
retired. He retired, but he didn't want to leave. And they had an absolutely wonderful candidate. Came from London. I mean, they paid for him to come from London. This was a big church. And when they had him come over when they had the reception for him, they invited the old pastor. And the old pastor went around telling the session members, he'll do. I think he'll do. And the associate and I are looking at each other thinking, what is going on here? Why is the old pastor here? And why is he putting his stamp of approval or saying anything to the session members? And so the next day, it was Sunday, the guy preaches his candidate sermon, at the end of which the congregation voted for the candidate. And of course they voted yes, because the old pastor had said, he'll do. And the candidate turned them down. Which was very embarrassing. And he said to them, you're not ready. And the associate and I looked at each other and went, he nailed that.
Well, in a sense, it did work, because...
But then they asked me to stay on, and I said...
That was good, Carol.
No, I said no. I said no. I said, evidently, what we have done hasn't worked. You need to call another interim.
That was so insightful. Just to go back a quick minute, you were a female pastor. I mean, that, back in the day, that was almost unheard of, right?
It was.
Yeah. So, what a remarkable hand of God. Yeah. So, we're almost, okay. So, you did the conflict management in churches for the
rest of my career.
The rest of your
Except the last one.
And are you still in California now?
Yeah, I'm in California.
Okay.
The very last one, after John and I were married, I'm trying to learn to be a wife again, because it's been, 40 years since I was married. And I thought, my career, I thought I was retired. And a friend called and said, would you look after the church for 2 weeks while I go on vacation? Sure. It turned into 5 years, but only because they were missing a pastor. And I said, I don't do what the missing pastor does, which was youth and something else, and education. I said, those are not my specialties. I don't do that. But I had handled the situation while the pastor was gone. And they liked the way I handled that situation. And they didn't want me to leave. So I ended up staying there 5 years. And I had said to God at some point, you owe me one. Because I had handled some pretty messy situations. And God delivered. I mean, this last church that I served, and the pastor called me the co-pastor. He didn't say I was the associate or the assistant. He called me a co-pastor, and sometimes he would refer me to me as the senior pastor because I was older. But, I'd say, you owe me one, but this church could have operated without any pastor because everybody took responsibility in this church. Everybody was a minister in this church. This was an absolutely fantastic church. So they were a joy. They were just a joy.
5 years,
Yeah.
and that's in California.
Mm-hmm.
And then
Oh.
comes John.
No, we were already married. Well, yeah. Then we came to Myrtle Beach, and Bobby said, "Will you come help out in Myrtle Beach?" Which I did for 2.5 years. That was just fun.
I have another. Does anybody else have a question? That's. Yeah. Yes. Oh, here. Hold.
You can just ask it. What took you to California? How did you get there? All of a sudden, you went from Indiana to California. It's a little bit of a long walk.
Okay,
Texas.
I've got to.
Texas. I was in Vancouver, Washington, then Texas, and I've been all over the place. It was a church. I went there to pastor a church in Sacramento. It was an interim. I had the most beautiful front yard of any church in the country, right across the street from the Capitol. Capitol Park was my front yard.
Been there. Probably saw your house.
This has been remarkable. There are so many questions about faith and God's hand. So as we close, Carol, how would you look at how you started out as a little girl and your mom coming to you that night saved your life, God's hand? How would you look, what would you say to us about faith? What would you say to us about God working in our lives? Just us right here. What would you say?
Let go and let God.
Yeah. Because it seemed like you didn't have in your life, you didn't plan that was going to happen. It just, like you said, you were an opportunist, but you were an opportunist because when God's hand moved, you were there and said,
Okay.
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 I don't know what this means, but I'm going to do it.
There's an old song, I can't remember all the words, but I don't worry about tomorrow, I just live from day to day. Yeah. And then you get to the chorus, many things are da-da-da-da. I can't. Anyway, I don't worry about the future.
Yeah. Yeah. It's in God's hands.
Yeah. Just taking what God gives you day to day.
I am so glad that somehow God got you here.
Me too. Me too.
This has been an honor, a deep honor. Thank you, Carol. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you all. Boy, that's a sermon for a month. You know, how to live.
There's that old hymn that my aunt sang, Trust and Obey.
And they were humming,
Yes,
humming and singing.
trust and obey, for there's no other way.
Yeah, well, it worked. Gosh. Yeah. Carol, that's just amazing.
It is.
I am so in awe of you and your life. I never knew. Isn't it just, yeah. So Meg and I were talking about God working in your life and God's hand, and you never know what's going to happen.